Hey Monster Hunters, if you're enjoying Beast and Bible, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and don't forget to share it with somebody who might like it. Now, on to the show.
Hey, this is producer Heather. Just a heads up, this episode discusses a Bible story that includes depictions of violence and sexual assault. Though the description of this story isn't overly graphic, if you have kids around or you don't want to hear that, feel free to sit this one out. All right, cue episode.
When my siblings and I were younger, we made the mistake of staying up at night long after our parents went to bed in order to watch a program from the USA Network entitled USA Up All Night. There were a variety of slightly edited for television shows on display, but none more consistent, at least in our part of the country, as the 1980s slasher films, most notably Friday the 13th. A boy who was born with physical deformities and hidden away by his overprotective mother. His mother gets a job as a cook at Camp Crystal Lake, where Jason is bullied by the other campers and ultimately thrown into the lake where he presumably drowns. Years later, he emerges as an undead killing machine who hacks and slashes his way through mischievous and promiscuous teenagers making use of the campgrounds. While many people love slashers, I don't. Even when I wasn't as particular about the media I consumed, they never really managed to machete their way into my heart. Still, they are an interesting cultural artifact that receives attention from a variety of disciplines, including theology. What's more is that there exists within the pages of the Bible a slasher story. In her well-known book, Texts of Terror, feminist biblical scholar Phyllis Tribble entitles her third chapter, An Unnamed Woman, The Extravagance of Violence. The chapter revolves around the alarming account in Judges 19 of a Levite's concubine who, after being raped, is left for dead and is taken by the Levite, a priestly figure, and chopped into 12 pieces and mailed to the 12 tribes of Israel. The last time I had my class read this story in Scripture, I received several incredulous expressions and sentiments. The most memorable was a young woman who said, "It didn't feel like I was reading the Bible." What do we do with texts of terror? How do we account for a biblical slasher that rivals any blood-soaked gore fest on the market? Join me and my two guests today as we find out. I'm calling this episode The Biblical Slasher, the Tale of the Levite's Concubine. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. To help me tackle this story, I have two guests with me today that I'm super excited to have here. First is Rahel Wells. She is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Andrews University in Michigan. And the second is Grafius, Associate Professor of Biblical Studies from Ecumenical Seminary in Michigan. Thank you so much both for being here. Before we get into the actual story today, the Levite's Concubine, I want to just talk a little bit about your background and what sort of things that you're studying and what kind of draws you to look at a topic like this. Rahel, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a background in biology, so I'm also interested in animals and that kind of things. But I have my PhD in Old Testament looking at God's care for animals in the Old Testament, and I'm currently working on various commentaries and Deuteronomy, etc. But I think what drew me to this story was really my major professor in my graduate studies, my doctoral studies. He had written a whole commentary on Judges. And so he would talk a lot about Judges. And so we had many conversations. And I just realized how much I valued the book of Judges, both for its relevance today and also for its just, I think, courage to tackle these difficult things that we often don't talk about in society and especially in the church. And so I've come to really value the difficulties in the stories in Judges, and that's part of why I'm drawn to this story.
Cool. Thank you. Brandon?
I love that statement about valuing the difficulties. That's really, really neat. So I also have a PhD in Hebrew Bible. My focus at Chicago Theological Seminary was the technical track is Bible culture and hermeneutics. And I was looking at Numbers 25 through the lens of contemporary horror theory, reading that basically. My research over the last decade or so has been really centered around these questions of how are particular parts of the Bible like horror stories? How can we read them as such? What does that do productively for ourselves, either as people of faith or just as people trying to look at these from the standpoint of culture? And then why in the world would there be stories of horror in the Bible? What are the original authors of the Bible doing to include such uncomfortable, difficult stories, poems, encounters in the text?
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to talking about this story today with the two of you.
Awesome. So just a brief, unnuanced recap for those who are unfamiliar with the story, what calling the biblical slasher of the Old Testament, the Levite's concubine, which starts in Judges 19 and continues from there. But essentially, you've got a Levite who has a concubine, and she's unfaithful, and she wanders away. He goes after her, finds her at her relative's house, and then they engage in sort of a reconciliation, what I kind of look at as a Midwestern Minnesota goodbye. It's like, okay, we've eaten together, it's time to go. No, why don't you stay and have some more food? Okay, we'll stay. And this goes back and forth for several verses. And eventually they have to leave. So they leave her family and they get to Gibeah. And they say, we need to turn in for the night. So they stay in the town square. No one will take them in until an elderly gentleman walks by and says, come with me. You can't stay in the town square. It's not safe. A bunch of young men from the town come out and they say, basically, we want to sexually assault you. No, you can't do that. They argue a little bit, and the story moves to where the Levite essentially takes his concubine and gives her to these people, and they sexually assault her all night long. The next morning, he opens the door, comes out. She's laying there on the doorstep, and very coldly says, "Get up." She doesn't move. He picks her up, and again, this is a very unnuanced, truncated version. We'll get into it here. Cuts her up into 12 pieces and puts her in the mail, and incites all sorts of angry, hostile feelings as would be expected from doing such a thing. I made my class, I teach this class called Monsters, Faith, and Pop Culture at Union College in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I made my class read this story, and so many of them, probably maybe a quarter of the class or more, had never seen this story in the Bible. And I remember getting looks of incredulity. They would look up from their Bible like, Dr. Pierce, what did we just read? What did you make, what did you make me read? Why is this in here? Which is why I want to tackle it. And so just flipping it now to both of you, Brandon, we'll start with you. Do you remember the first time that you read this story, and how did it affect you?
The first time I read this story, it was similar to your students in seminary, finally going through the Old Testament cover to cover. And realizing that there was a whole bunch of stuff in Judges and a lot of the parts of the Bible that I'd never run into in church. It's one of those stories that's kind of you might say, poorly kept secret in the church, that we just kind of pretend it's not there and deal with the easier stuff most of the time.
Yeah, I would say the first time I read it, I don't remember specifically the first time I read it because my parents, I'm blessed that both my parents, my dad teaches Old Testament and my mom teaches systematic theology. So they were very much always wanting us to understand all of the Bible. So we would talk about the hard stuff and we would wrestle with it. And I remember them saying to me, not specifically about this story, but we'd talk about lots of different hard stories and just say, hey, the Bible people were not perfect. They were really messed up. And it's important that we remember that, right? There's no heroes. The hero is God, not people. And so that's always helped me. So I don't think I've ever had an issue with this story per se personally. It was always, again, students, my youth group. In fact, as in my church, we have a Bible study every Friday night at my house, and I would go through Judges every couple of years because I'm I want them, because they usually would hear Judges are these heroes and these amazing people. And I'm like, no, I want you to know that they weren't, actually. They were pretty messed up. And yet God was still able to use them, even though they were really screwed up characters and they did really horrible, evil things. So yeah, I don't remember specifically the time, but I am grateful that I didn't get the kind of normal treatment that people have. That helped me, I think, to come at this story in a more maybe holistic way.
Sure. Thank you. So, Brandon, let's start with you. With your work on horror in the Bible and theology in horror, how does the lenses that you develop looking at the horror genre, how does it help you interpret a passage of Scripture like this?
There are, I think, a couple of things that it offers to us. The first thing for me is kind of a big picture, just reorientation, that we often approach the Bible with the assumption that all of these texts are going to be morally uplifting. that we are to look for the Bible. I every now and then will still have a student come into seminary giving me the acronym of basic instructions before leaving Earth or something like that. And while there certainly are instructions, and certainly much of the Bible is morally uplifting, if you come at it from the lens that everything has to be, you can get yourself twisted up into some uncomfortable knots. And I think this is one of those stories that does that, because it's not morally uplifting, as Rahel really clearly demonstrated. There are no heroes present in the characters of the story. We have to wait for God to show up to get our hero to come. So it kind of unravels, looking at it through the lens of horror, kind of unravels some of those assumptions that this has to be good, morally edifying literature, and that's the only thing it can be in the Bible. Instead, it can open us up to the idea that, well, maybe some of this is ugly, maybe some of it is not supposed to make us feel good. So I think that's one thing. And then the second thing that I would suggest is that when we look at horror, we can begin to see how all of our horror stories reflect some underlying anxiety within our culture, within ourselves as individuals. Whether you look at it from a sociological perspective or a psychoanalytic perspective, it's still about an anxiety that we have. And I think we can begin to, by using this lens of horror, interrogate the biblical text for what anxieties are underneath there as well. So I think it kind of models how we can begin to unpack these stories that are sometimes very resistant to unpacking.
Yeah. One of the tenets of monster theory, which is used all over the place, when looking at texts like this or cultural artifacts, movies, books that deal with horror or monsters, is the monster as a cultural body. That's sort of the first, tenet, the first thesis of Cohen's monster theory. So you mentioned that a story like this sort of reveals some of the anxieties. Would you unpack that a little bit more, Brandon, as far as what do you think from just your study, your perspective, what sort of anxieties is this speaking to?
So that idea of the monster's cultural body is a really, really powerful one. Just that every monster has something beneath it that speaks more directly to our own lives. So I think in this particular story of Judges 19, we clearly see the anxiety about what happens when society breaks down. That there's that repeated refrain throughout this section of Judges that in that time there was no king in Israel, so people did whatever was right in their own eyes. So you can see the story as kind of an apologetic for why we need a kingship. But even more than that, about this anxiety of what happens when our social structures don't protect us. What kind of a mess do we get when we have to take things into our own hands, so to speak? So to me, it really speaks to those anxieties of social structures that aren't working anymore.
Yeah, good. Rahel, let's pivot to you now. How do you approach the story through your hermeneutical tradition, your experience in teaching Old Testament at Andrews University? How do you come at this story?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think so often we read things by themselves, right? And I think for me, the whole book of Judges is really intended to be read, comes right after Deuteronomy. It's intended to be read in light of Deuteronomy, right? And so when we read it separate from that, and even when we read it separate from the beginning of Judges, we often misread it. So it's really at the beginning of Judges, we find that the people are, as you already mentioned, Brandon, they're totally turning away from God, right? They're not doing what they're supposed to do. They were supposed to destroy all the religions around them. Instead, they start worshiping their gods. They're intermarrying with the people all around them. They're totally abandoning and leaving God. And so Judges is showing the descent, the moral descent, right, of Israel until really they become worse than Sodom. And in fact, this story, if you compare it with Genesis 19, there's a section of it that has almost a quarter of the words are identical to Genesis 19, which is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where, of course, the two angels come into the city and they try to spend the night in the square, and Lot brings them into his house, and then the men come and they say, we want to rape these men, and Lot's like, no, I'll give you my daughters, right? But then, of course, miracles happen, and that doesn't happen. But it's almost identical. So the host says the same thing, the people say the same thing. So, but here in Judges, it ends up much worse. So I think the intent of the author of Judges is saying, look, you are worse than Sodom. Israel has become her own worst enemy. She doesn't need any other enemies. they're destroying themselves, right? So it's that context that we see of Israel having not being obedient to God. And Dr. Block, who I studied under, he calls this time in Judges the Canaanization of Israel. So they were supposed to shed God's light into Canaan, and instead they become Canaan, and they become worse than Canaan, right? And so I think that's significant. And then, as you already kind of hinted at, Brandon, the story gets worse from there, right? So the rest of the context of the story is that they all get up in arms and they go and they say, we can't let this happen. And so we're going to kill all the Benjamites, which was the tribe where this happened. So they kill them all, and then, or almost all of them, through a long series of battles. And then they realize, oh my goodness, we've destroyed a tribe. What do we do? And there's 600 men left. So they're like, we're going to go and get wives for them. So they go and destroy another town that hadn't come to help them destroy the Benjamites. And they take 400 of their women, which was all that were left, that were virgins, and they give them to but there's only 400 and they need 600. And so then they tell, the last part of Judges is they tell the last 200 men, you can lie in wait and ambush these young women that are going to the feast of the Lord and take them as your wives. And that's how the book ends. So it's really this, like, Israel destroys herself, right? They have this civil war. They ultimately are their own worst enemy. And so none of the judges are intended, I don't think, to be heroes. They're intended to show this moral descent. Yes, there's a few of them who do good things, but by the time you get to the end of the book, truly, as you already mentioned, Brandon, everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes. And that's how the book ends. There's no king. Everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes. So, and I think the no king element is also referring to God. So not only do they need an earthly king, but they've also rejected their heavenly king. So there's this both and dissension, as it were, away from God and away from all that he desires for them.
Yeah.
And I think that really gets at this connection that you mentioned, Rahel, between Judges 19 and the story in Genesis, that we have such a similar matching story. So if we've already read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we would expect the same thing to happen, that God comes and intervenes.
Correct.
Instead, God doesn't intervene. So really the end of the book of Judges, we're left with this, God has temporarily left the building.
Right.
Which is really a horrifying place to be.
It is. It is. And yet, I think he still wants to be there, right? The people are just pushing him away.
Sure.
Right? They're totally
course.
abandoning him. And so even though he does interact a little bit with them in Judges 20 and 21, he's mostly silent. And he doesn't come and, although, of course, he is still there, right? He still cares about his people, but they've just totally left him. They've become these Canaanites, basically.
In keeping with our slasher theme, I have emerged unexpectedly to cut something in half, namely this episode. However, even with only half the discussion done, we have a lot to think about. How do you feel about such horrible tales lurking within the pages of the Bible? Why do you feel that they have been allowed to exist? We have a tendency to cling to children's story theologies and ideas that all of faith and faith history are happy, shiny, and pretty. However, the Bible is unflinching in its honest depiction of humanity's selfishness and violent tendencies. I don't think these stories exist to shame us, and I certainly don't think they are here to enable us to promote violence, but they're there to remind us that without a healthy spiritual connection, even the best of us can become monsters and do terrible things. Join us next episode as Brandon, Rahel, and I wrap up our discussion of the biblical slasher. And as always, thank you for listening to Beast and Bible.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.